Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and today we are going to be taking a look at one of the biggest questions and biggest issues facing both countries in the Ukraine war. This is, of course, the damage to the economies. How bad is it going to be? We're going to take a look and compare both Ukraine and Russia and think in the long term, which country is going to end up worse off. Let's get into it. First, let's take a look at Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, one of the estimates that seems to be about right is that the war is going to cause their economy to shrink by about a third. This is from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and you can see in Ukraine GDP data, it looks like 2022 is on pace to have that 1/3 reduction in GDP. But this conflict is going to be about more than that. Let's take a look at what exactly has happened that's going to cause this. First, in Ukraine, you have the destruction of cities, right? You have the destruction of territory. And when you have, of course, conventionally, you think of it, your office spaces, your buildings, your factories, when they're destroyed in the fighting, they cannot be used to produce goods and services, right? That's what we think of most classically about the damage that war does. A good example would be the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, right? The site of a lot of fighting that's basically been rendered completely destroyed and is a major economic hub for the city and the country at large. But you also, of course, have the cost of human lives. You have to remember, especially for fighting forces, right? By definition, a soldier is someone who is usually younger, between 19 and 25, physically healthy. These are some of your most productive citizens, right? A 19-year-old has 5 decades or more of potential productive work they can engage in, contributions to your economy. And when one of those soldiers is killed or seriously wounded, they often become instead a drain on the economy, requiring significant care. Families often receive pensions or payments, and many of these soldiers simply are unable to work, or at least to the same degree they could have had they not had the experience of going to war. So that also is a human cost and an economic cost that goes into decades, right? To say nothing of, again, the human, emotional, and moral cost to, killing people. Civilians have the same thing when you're taking out, when you see civilians killed and wounded in these conflicts, it's a significant cost because of the loss all through the economy and through the future. Since 2020, the Ukrainian hryvnia has lost nearly half its value. Since June, the Russian ruble is down 20%. This conflict is a reminder that no matter where you keep your wealth, there is always risk. And diversification is an essential tool to manage that risk. I've seen even my portfolio take a hit, even as the cost of everything is rising. That's why I wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Masterworks. Masterworks is the platform for regular people like you and I to invest in art. Pieces by legendary artists like Monet, Basquiat, Banksy, Warhol, and others used to be only available to the super wealthy and institutions. The ultra wealthy don't just buy art to appreciate the colors. They use fine art as an investment, and the data shows that it pays off. Over the past 26 years, contemporary art prices have outperformed the S&P 500 net return by 131%. Masterworks lets retail investors, regular people like you and I, break into the fine art market that used to be just a billionaire's club. When a valuable work of art goes up for sale, Masterworks purchases the piece and files with the SEC to make it a public offering. Masterworks members then invest in shares of the painting, and Masterworks later sells the art and distributes the proceeds to shareholders. To date, they've sold 6 paintings with an average return of 29% to investors, and that's during a year where the S&P 500 has dropped 23%. Even better, historically, art is not correlated with stocks or bonds, meaning art can be a good hedge in inflation and a valuable tool for diversification. There's currently a waitlist to join, but with my code down below, you can skip the waitlist and start investing in artwork today. By Russia. The one stat estimates that only about 20 to 30% of agricultural land in Ukraine might not be planted or harvested this year at all. But in subsequent years, one of the things that people forget is the tremendous economic costs of unexploded ordnance, and undetonated mines. In this conflict, Russia and Ukraine, but it seems like primarily Russia, have been relying on mines and mining operations. This means that when the conflict ends, I doubt Russia is going to be sending its troops back to Ukraine to clean up after themselves and pick up all their mines. Ukraine does appear to be attempting to track the location of mines in places, but in any conflict, right, bureaucracy and chaos is sort of the rule of the day. So the chances that there will be significant amounts of unexploded ordnance in many fields is significant. That's not even to talk about UXO, unexploded ordnance, which is not just mines and improvised explosive devices, but actual artillery or missiles that land in a field and do not detonate because of some flaw in the manufacture. They're still very, very dangerous and can easily destroy or kill someone who's unsuspecting and sort of comes upon them and disturbs them. That means that in order to get many of this acreage back up to being grown, the Ukrainian government is going to have to engage in a massive scale of mine clearing. They're going to have to figure out ways to clear thousands, probably millions of acres. And this is a massive economic undertaking. But until they're clear, significant portions of Ukrainian land is going to have to remain fallow. This is, again, going to drag further on their country. Even more so is that the economy of Ukraine is pivoting heavily towards war spending. The almost entire country is on a war footing. It's spending basically every penny it has on its military, so much so that Western countries are often having to step in and provide funding for essential services like, handling the massive number of displaced refugees, handling expanding medical care to civilians, et cetera, et cetera. What that means isn't happening is essential development projects, right? There's a lot of types of infrastructure that only the government is big enough to undertake. This would be, for example, building a new port or expanding a rail system or building a new, better highway system. All of these things drive economic growth, but at the end of the day, no individual company is going to go in and build a new highway system or expand the ports. That's something that only the government can do. Similarly, you talk about investing in education, investing in hospitals, investing in your people's health care. Those are things that offer economic returns for a generation. But if all that funding is going towards the war effort, it's not going toward these other important economic drivers. But not all is bad for Ukraine. We have to remember, first off, they're receiving a lot of Western aid. And Western aid, we think of it most classically as weapons, ammunition, guns, etc. But there's more to it than that. They're receiving, as we talked about, sometimes straight cash to fund their social programs. They are receiving a lot of Western mentorship and guidance. They're receiving a lot of Western intelligence. And of course, they are also having their neighbors and Western countries receive a lot of their population as refugees. This will, of course, keep that population able to perhaps eventually return to Ukraine instead of having these people stay within the country and drain further the government's resources. So all of this Western aid, there's also a hope that when the war ends, Western countries will continue to provide aid and assistance in the reconstruction, as well as providing some redevelopment spending that's going to help incentivize Ukrainians, for example, towns to rebuild their office buildings, rebuild their factories, and do other projects to help redevelop their economy. But I think it's really worth noting that historically, Western countries will support a conflict. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They will support a combatant in a conflict, but once the conflict ends, it's much harder to convince Western voters to continue to send money to support the reconstruction efforts. A good example would be the U.S. public, who very much supported the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union was defeated, there was no real effort to fund the reconstruction of Afghanistan. There is a fear that something similar could play out in Ukraine if simply Western governments declare victory when they see Russia retreat out of the country. There's also, of course, and that would be a double risk if there is a economic recession. When times are tough, voters oftentimes get more resentful of their elected officials spending their taxpayer money on citizens halfway across the world when their own citizens are struggling economically. And there's a good chance going forward that we may see those types of events. Now, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the cost to Russia. Russia is obviously the other combatant here, and in some ways seems to be perhaps paying actually the larger price, despite the fact that it seems like Ukraine is paying a pretty bad price itself. First off, of course, we can talk about the significant number of Russian forces that have been killed and wounded in this conflict. Right, around 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed so far, U.S. intelligence estimates, and about 3 times that number wounded, for a total of about 50,000 people. Again, you're talking about 50,000 19 to 25-year-old men who are otherwise healthy. That's a lot of productive hours, productive years of life, of economic contribution that have been wiped out in this conflict from Russia. We also need to acknowledge, right, there is a small number, I think, of Russian civilians who've been killed, but very, very, very small comparatively. Russia is way less transparent with its military costs, but this has created massive, massive military expenditures. We don't really know for sure, but what we do know is that supply and demand, even Russia cannot escape it. And while Ukraine has a massive supply of weapons being provided basically gratis, Russia has to purchase the raw materials and manufacture its equipment more or less by itself. Almost no other country is contributing to the Russian military, save Iran, that appears to be doing a small number of drone technology. But countries like China, countries like India, other major countries who are broadly favorable to Russia in outlook have not provided them with any military support. That means that if Russia wants something made, it has to make it itself. And that's tough because their economy has to pivot and they have to continually buy ever more expensive raw materials or make cuts to their military's equipment. Either way, it's a huge, massive expenditure that's only going to grow over time. That's why even Russia's own central bank, who's probably going to be pretty favorable to Russia and to the Russian party line, so to speak, is estimating a contraction between 4 and 10% this year. To give you an idea, the U.S. GDP in the Great Financial Crisis dropped, I think, less than 1%. I think it dropped. And that was a significant downturn, right? A painful recession if there ever was one. The other big problem that Russia's going to have to deal with in the longer term is sanctions. And again, just because Russia loses the war does not necessarily mean that the sanctions will be lifted. Western countries recognize that this sort of behavior cannot stand, right? Russia voluntarily withdrawing may convince some countries to lift sanctions, but if Russia continues to attempt this fight, assert that it owns these countries, owns these provinces of Ukraine, and continues to try to push this as a military intervention, the sanctions are going to hit harder and harder and harder. This is a long-term problem for the Russian economy in a way that The Ukraine economy hopefully will be able to be in a position after the war to start to bounce back, whereas Russia, it may look like a sprinter wearing a weighted backpack. They simply are, while the war will end and hopefully them and Ukraine will, in some ways, their economies will be both at the start line. Russia is going to just be unable to grow anywhere nearly as effectively given the strength of sanctions. There's also, of course, the danger of the current consequences to its infrastructure. Now, Russia obviously has not had its territory damaged or invaded or destroyed by the way Ukraine's has been, but damage to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, damage to the Crimean Bridge are significant economic blows nonetheless. And they really do impact Russia's ability, especially to export one of its primary industries, primary exports, natural gas. But one of the other things that's a problem is that for Russia, gas is not like exporting food, right? The food industry requires inputs. It requires a bunch of outputs, and it produces, obviously, outputs. But oil just is different. It sits under the ground. You need some infrastructure in place to pull it out, and then you just have to sell it. It's as close to free money as you can get. And for Russia, that means that they always have a potential engine to help pay back their debts and to help fund any new economic development that they want to try to undertake. Russia still has economic partners, most significantly is China, who has shown that they are at least willing to buy Russian oil, even if they've been respectful of other Western sanctions. And China's economy, and India is another example. China and India, when the war ends, are more likely to be willing, probably will be the first countries willing to deal more openly and fully with Russia. And they're big enough economies that, frankly, those two alone could really help drive Russian growth. So all this to say, I think it's fair to expect that the lion's share of the economic burden of this war is almost certainly going to be borne by Ukraine. But that does not mean that in the long term, Russia is going to escape from this unscathed. Depending on how much of a pariah they become from the international system, they may find that, and depending on how willing Western countries are to invest in the redevelopment of Ukraine after the end of this conflict, that is going to drive who is ultimately going to end up paying the real economic price. As always, guys, if you want access to some exclusive content, combat video breakdowns that I cannot show you on YouTube, that are just too intense, become a member of the Patreon, and I will see you guys in the next one.